I am going to begin today's painting with this very muted orange tone. It's simply mixed between the orange hue, a little bit of titanium white, a ivory black, tiny bit of cadmium red. So what I'm doing with this is I'm just beginning here on my mountains on the opposite side that the light will be coming from. The light is going to be coming through this mountain and that mountain, illuminating this side. And so I'm simply taking my darker tone here, which I'm going to use for a lot of these shadows, and I'm kind of placing it on in horizontal and vertical strokes. And I'm doing this because mountains are generally made up of stair-like shapes. I'm not trying to fill in the entirety of the side cast in shadows. I'm just trying to get a good portion of it, remembering that varying parts will be sticking out and protruding, and those will actually be receiving portions of light. So that's very important to be cognizant of while we render this. We don't want just one side that's dark and then one side that's bright. Each side is going to have a mixture of both features. Then I'm going to take a slightly brighter version of the same color and apply that in the areas I missed. So here I'm just kind of moving my brush predominantly again in horizontal and vertical strokes, but occasionally I'll make something different just to create a ledge or find a way to make this mountain interesting. We want to very much diversify it. And then when I feel like I find an area that needs a little bit of darker pigment, I will work that in as well. With the darker pigment, I'm also trying to create little details. So I'll create strange lines, blend them back. Now that can be a shadow, but perhaps it opens up again on the other side. And that receives light, but this divot inside, it doesn't. It's about creating these little interesting intricacies. Almost imagine that you yourself are going to travel through these landscapes and just figure out how you'd move through them and what paths could be made and that sort of thing. And generally when you do that, you find ways to complicate it to a reasonable extent and make it very interesting. You can really see it progressing now. I'm still just taking a lot of that darker pigment. I'm working it back in, trying to create little designs, as many little paths as I can with this brush. Now I could move to a smaller brush. However, I like how much a square-headed brush holds. I like how it has a sharp tip on the edge. And so for me, I really enjoy this brush. I also like completing paintings using one or two brushes of the same kind, just so you still see that brush stroke and it has that cohesive feel. I don't want everything perfectly blended. I still want you to know and see that it is a painting, because I love the medium itself. There we are. Just diversifying. But you can still see that that side is much more dark than this illuminated side over here. So we're adding in all of this contrast, but we're still being very much aware of where our light is coming from. So now that I have the top portion fairly well drawn in, and I will go back and add varying things, but right now I want to move down the mountain here. And as we said, the light was going to be coming through this way. So this portion of the mountain needs to consist of those colors, but in a more saturated and probably lighter value. So with that in mind, here we have the darks, here we have a lot of the lights, and now I've mixed this third color, which is very close, but a little bit more saturated and a little bit lighter. And this is going to become the brighter color and tone for the bottom here. Now you'll notice that up here there is a little bit of yellow ochre and more of an orange hue. I will be incorporating this down here, but I added those over the base of the previous brighter color. So this will be more dominant than this, as it should be. And I'm just working around the areas where I'm going to have all of my mist and mountains. Now, you could paint the mountains over the mist area and then paint the mist over top. And I will do that for portions of it, and I'll also make sure that the mountains go down to a point where when I'm feathering the edges of the cloud and the mist, it does go over the mountain, so it doesn't just look boring. Something to keep in mind, that you are creating enough mountain when you're creating mist in it that you have a good portion to cover and have an interesting, diverse aesthetic. There, we'll just blend them together very roughly. And I will go back to my darker tones and begin to create interesting shapes. Here, because it's at the bottom, I do want it to be a little bit more loose. I want the eye to be up here for the most part, so I'm just creating very different loose designs with my brush. And then creating the shadows and just making it all make sense in context with the lighting. There we are. I'm going to finish this. I will see you very soon. Now I'm working on this rock here in the forefront. It's not going to be as close as the ones we have over on the left, but it's certainly going to be closer than this one. And that means it's going to need a little bit more saturation. As I'm moving up in the painting in regards to mountains, I've decided to add a little bit more red, and that way we get some really nice rich red tones over here on the far left. At this point, it's probably going to look a little bit more pink, and that's fine because again, this is a very bright area. This is where all of our light is going to be emitting and coming from. So right now, I'm just taking my newly mixed brighter tone. Again, it's the old tone, a little bit of red, a little bit more white, and I'm just blocking in all of the brighter areas. For the contrast, and for the darker portions, I'll probably go with a tone fairly similar to that. I don't want to make it too dark because I still want room to make this area really stand out with values, because this area is going to stand out through the light. Now here I'm just going in and applying my shadows with that darker tone that I had before and a little mix of red. You see, if we just added black to the mix that we had, we'd get a much more desaturated value for our darks. And because it's much more in the forefront, this rock, we want to ensure that the saturation is ever increasing. And so, just to ensure that our dark tones progress naturally from this rock to this rock, I'm just throwing in a little bit of red just like we did with the highlights. Now I'm simply taking a mixture of titanium white, of orange hue, of yellow ochre, and I'm creating this mist. This mist is illuminated, and the light's all coming from in between here. So it's going to be quite bright, and it's going to have even warmer tones than a lot of the piece. So I'm just taking my small square-headed brush, the same one that I used in the mountains. I apply a lot of pigment in a select middle area, and then I kind of try to drag it outwards. Now I'm dragging it out in a number of ways. I will kind of take some paint, and then maybe I'll lift it to another area to make another dense, small piece. And then I will go around the area, kind of in circular motions, but at the same time, I still want to kind of direct the pigment. So here, I kind of want these two to connect to a point. So I'm moving circularly, creating a nice see-through, transparent aesthetic with it, and then eventually moving it up here. So I'm not trying to just create one line of strokes, and I'm not trying to just create a lot of spheres. I'm trying to create something that's always evolving, moving, and changing. Again, taking more from the middle, trying to keep a rhythm within it, and applying it somewhere else, and just expanding. Of course, when an area gets very thin, we can simply take more pigment, go back, and re-add it. You can add it even on the outskirt areas. There we are. Now I've taken this color and really put a lot more gray into it. And I'm going to use this predominantly for my sky. I'm using a square-headed brush yet again because it's great for working around these sharp angles because it itself has a good edge, and a square-headed brush can carry a good amount of pigment. I will probably go over the majority of the sky again with the smaller brush to instill more line work and that sort of thing. However, just to get the initial layer of pigment on, I'm going to use this. I'm also using this brush as opposed to something much larger, or even something like this, because if you were to use a really large brush, you get a very flat aesthetic, and by using this, I can really direct the strokes within the sky. So you see them, and I'm going to move them in this direction. So the eye is always being led back into the painting, as opposed to a very flat sky that doesn't have any directional qualities at all. You can direct the eye through the composition, and you can also do it through your use of ambiguous brush strokes. There we are. You can still kind of see through, which isn't a bad thing. That's why we paint an underlayer in a specific color. You can also scrape off paint to show more of the underlayer, and then you have varying cloud-like tones. But you don't have to do that. You can achieve that through paint itself. This can just act as an easy way to kind of sketch out how you want clouds to move in the future of your painting. There we are. Now, as you can see, I've applied clouds throughout the sky, but I've done it with the exact same color that I used down here, and I used the same technique. It was apply it in the middle in an interesting streak or line, and then blend outwards. I also tried to make it wrap around the painting, so the eye was never really led out of it. Now, with that in mind, I'm now going in and diversifying the sky. I'm creating this opening portion in the sky. And that can really create a lot of questions as to, well, what do we put there color-wise, with the rest of the painting being the way that it is. So what I chose to do was take this color and add a lot of gray to this. This is almost a pure gray with a tiny bit of yellow ochre and orange hue. However, because it's right beside this very warm orange tone, it's going to look much cooler, and it's also going to look almost as if it has a purple or blue tone to it. So by simply desaturating it and putting it beside something very warm, we can trick the eye into thinking it's something very different from what it actually is. And that way we diversify our painting without losing the cohesive nature of all of our colors. And just to really give you an idea, there's the same color on the color palette, where here it looks like a real gray, doesn't it? And there, not so much. It's amazing how that happens. So just keep in mind that when you put a color beside another color, it will visually trick your eye one way or the other. And that's something to be aware of when you get into more complicated color mixing. It's also important to note that for parts of this sky, I'm making very soft gradients, where others I'm keeping it hard. And I can do that using this square-headed brush because it does have a sharper edge and can carry a good amount of paint. Now down here, I'm creating more mountains, and these here are going to be much more in the distance. Now down here, I'm creating more mountains. I'm using the same small brush I was using before, and even the same pigment. I'm using the brighter tone that I used over here in the mountains, and I'm doing this because I want this area to be consistently brighter. However, this mountain range, it's much farther back than this one, so we need to remember that because it's in the distance, it's going to have a very different value and saturation. So this needs to be less saturated than that, and it also needs to not be as dark or as light. So I'm beginning by just putting on a very simple base of this initial pigment. Then I'm going in and I'm grabbing the medium color that I used in here, and I'm implementing that for my shadows. Just trying to create little ledges and make it interesting in one way or another. I don't want to do too much because, again, this is in the background, but you don't want it to be boring or one-dimensional. So I'm just creating a lot of little different intricacies. Once all of this is finished and it gets dry to the point where it's not fully dry but it's a little bit tacky, I will take this color and I'll start blending it on top of this. Not to the point where you don't see it, but to the point where it doesn't look to the same extent in the foreground as this does. However, before we do that, you should also note that all of this mist and fog and clouds down here, it's not going to be completely thick through the entirety of it. So I'm actually going to pick an area. I'm going to work some more mountains in very softly. On one edge, I will blend it. But the idea is that everything's moving through, and perhaps it missed part of this mountain that's jetting out. It's just a way of making it a little more natural, a little more interesting. And you can do that in a number of areas to different extents. By having it touch that edge, you're really showing that it is behind this rock formation here. Just using a bunch of little tricks. Softening the bottom, but you can still see the edge. I have to be really delicate here. And not in the sense of really taking your time and making minuscule little strokes, but just being very aware of how each piece is going to interact with the rocks around it and the clouds around it as well. There we are. Now I've moved over to the larger square-headed brush, and I'm beginning with it looks like a mixture of brown, but really again, it's just more of these colors. And I know at this point, hearing me talk about color is probably incredibly boring because I don't use any different ones. But I think that's an important lesson to recognize, that you don't need to use any greens in a painting. You don't need to use any blues in a painting. You really don't need to use anything. And sometimes when you constrain yourself to only using 4 or 5, maybe 6 different pigments, including black or white, you really have to get innovative, and you can end up with something very subtly interesting. So with all of that being said, I'm just putting down a base coat here. The intent is not to really do a lot of detail. I'm just kind of figuring out through strokes what I want this to look like. And then from there, I'll add in both the darker and the lighter tones. Now, this rock formation, it's very much in the forefront, much more so than these two. And so because of that, this will be much more saturated. It will have darker darks. And I'd say lighter lights, but because the light source is coming from here, I think I'm going to leave it fairly dark. There we are. I'm also scraping a lot of the paint because it is an underlayer. I don't want the pigment to build up too quickly, and I don't want to get something very muddy. There we go. Now here I'm just kind of moving around this very dark pigment, trying to create separation in my rocks. And I want the brush strokes to be prominent, so I'm not blending it to be smooth, but I'm just ensuring that it's not a bunch of extremely harsh lines. Now this is a very, very dark mixture of gray, and it's something that I reserved for the foreground, because again, we're increasing the value and the darkness as we get to the foreground. Now, as I do this, I'm trying to ensure that I'm creating varying shapes, and I kind of created some while I was just using that initial tone, but here we have some pieces that are moving to the right. Here we have a larger piece, a little circular oval piece, and then here you kind of have this triangular shape. And the idea is that it's always changing and we're never creating the same shape on the rock twice. So try to start with very basic geometric shapes. Here again, oval, a triangle, a myriad of squares or rectangles. Just continuously try to advance and change what you're doing. Now, there's an example of where it's a little bit too dark, so I'm going to do some scraping. And that scraping created portions of other little rocks. So don't worry about messing up, because rocks are so organic and interesting that, you know, it's just something that's naturally going to evolve in a very strange way. So when you have to go back and move pigment around, you generally render something that looks much more natural than perhaps what you would have even intended initially. Taking colors from varying areas, moving them to others, and here you notice that it's a lot more red, and there I'm using a little bit of burnt sienna, a little bit of orange hue, And finally, a little bit of cadmium yellow. And there's it applied. I do need to add some gray to it, however, because at this point it is just far too saturated. There we are. Applying it to different areas. Rendering something interesting. Now here I'm just using a mixture of burnt sienna and black, a little bit of titanium white, orange hue, and even a tiny bit of yellow ochre. And I'm just kind of trying to figure out where I want my tree to be and how I want it to evolve. You can end up with a really boring tree if you make it just go straight upwards. So giving it a lot of interesting little movements can really aid your painting. However, you don't want to overcomplicate it. You don't want it to take over everything else. And so here I'm just starting with very thin limbs, and then I'm expanding them. I'll make them larger from there once I know how I'd like the tree to progress and evolve. But this is just an underlayer here of paint. Just kind of almost sketching out what I want. Because we did an initial sketch, but once you add paint to the rest of it, the rest of the painting evolves to a point. And so your drawing needs to as well. With that in mind, I'm making sure that my edges aren't too sharp, because I don't want this tree to look like it was cut out and put on. I'm doing slight blends on the edges, just a little bit of feathering, keeping it all clean while I work on it, even though it's just the initial rough layer. And again, make sure you incorporate lots of little divots and interesting little pieces. Because in nature, trees rarely grow straight and without little hazards in them. I'm also making sure I scrape a good amount of the paint because it is the first layer, and I'm going to need to layer more on top. So now here I'm taking a little bit of yellow ochre, black, orange hue, and I'm simply dabbing it along the edges and sometimes inner pieces here of my tree. And this is kind of a moss that's growing up from the bottom. As we get higher, it will dissipate, but it's going to give the tree an added interesting color, and it's going to give us a different texture. Now, I'm not scraping in any of this moss. I'm simply tapping it on with my brush, and it's going to be a little bit textured. It's going to be coming off the canvas to a point. And this is also going to add a little bit of diversity. If you were to blend it in and scrape it, you might have an issue because the color will change. The yellow ochre will be diluted, and it won't take that really nice vibrant aesthetic that it is right now. So I'm just going to continue this, and I'll do it on both trees to a point. Again, it's a tapping motion, not a scraping motion. Now I'm taking more of that color that we used for the moss, and I'm creating a plethora of little leaves amongst our two trees here. Now I'm just taking my brush, I'm applying it on the side, and then I'm turning it as I move the stroke. This is creating a sharp little piece of pigment. It's going to pop off of the painting to a point. You have to be fairly gentle. You're not trying to push the paint in. You're just trying to have it move from the brush onto the canvas, almost like a tap, but as opposed to just going straight with it, you're doing a moving motion of that tap. So takes a little bit of practice, but eventually you get these very sharp, nice little leaves. I'm trying to create them in different clusters, as you can see, but I'm also leaving little openings in them. I'm trying to make sure that each cluster of leaves is very different from the next one, creating that diversity again. And sometimes they're just going to blend right into the background there. As you can see, it doesn't really get much of a difference. And that's good because the color is going to be similar sometimes, and you shouldn't adjust it just so it stands out. Naturally, a lot of it won't. And so really, if you want to aid your painting in the best way, don't oversaturate it or change the value to really stand out. So now we are almost finished. I thank you so much for spending this time here with me today. I hope you've enjoyed. I hope you've learned something. And I also hope to see you next Saturday. I truly hope you've enjoyed, and again, if you have any questions or inquiries regarding today's painting, I implore you to leave me a comment in the comment section down below. I'd be more than happy to attend to it and help you in any way that I can. Now, all of that being said, if you've enjoyed today's video, if perhaps you'd like to see more, then I'd implore you to hit that subscribe button and consider signing up for my weekly newsletter. Upon signing up for that, I will send you a free real-time painting tutorial of a winter cardinal, and in addition, every Saturday I will also send you an update email including all of the videos that I've released from the past week and also tips and tricks. On a similar note, if perhaps you'd just like to see what I'm doing, stay up to date, see my work, and perhaps even send me a message, you can find me over on Facebook.com. Now, all of that being said, again, I truly hope you've enjoyed. My name's Ryan O'Rourke. I hope to see you next Saturday, and above all, stay creative.